Well, Dr. Tharp, if you want to go ahead and start your presentation, I sure appreciate you doing this. It's a different world, as we already talked about, and normally we would probably be seeing these presentations at our research station or at an extension event. And this has just given us an opportunity to learn from you and you an opportunity to visit with us, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet. It's good to hear from you guys and see you. It's crazy times we're in. So I sure appreciate everyone being on board. I'm not sure how many we have in our audience today, but welcome. This is going to be a mix and match. Usually I'm very focused on one topic, but this will be interesting. We get to jump around a little bit and talk about the benefits of the private applicator program, specifically the private applicator license, as well as a little bit on minimizing non-target injury. And we have a blurb on one interesting topic that you've probably heard about, glyphosate and cancer. Now, what is the Montana Private Applicator License? This isn't all we do at the university, but this is part of what we do at the university. For me, I'm the coordinator of the pesticide education program, so we support commercial programs, private programs, just answering questions in general. We do a lot more than this, but we, through an MOU with the Department of Ag, are responsible for coordinating the private applicator program. And that's for about 5,500 restricted use private applicators across the state. And just a little bit about that, it's also known as the Farm Applicator License. This is mainly for individuals wishing to apply restricted use pesticides on land that they own, rent, or lease. Must be on an ag commodity, but it's pretty flexible as to what that means. It can range from small acreages up to larger farms. This could be rangeland, pasture, forests, row crops, nurseries, greenhouses. As long as they own, rent, or lease these different sites, it would fall under the private applicator license. Now, I did mention restricted use pesticides, and for those of you that are unfamiliar with that terminology, the chemicals that you purchase, let's say from Ace Hardware or Home Depot, where you don't need a license, most chemicals out there, including Milestone, 2,4-D products, at least most of them, Roundup, and many, many others are called general use pesticides, where on the first page of the label, you will not see anything. Now, on the first page of a restricted use label, you will see restricted use pesticide at the very top. You will need a license to purchase these. These have, I don't like the terminology EPA uses. It's just less flexible than the general use pesticides, where they can cause significant adverse effects on the humans, animals, and or the environment. You just have less flexibility for misuse with these products, so it requires a restricted use license. Some examples that are common in the farm applicator realm would be Tordon for controlling noxious weeds, fumitoxin or phostoxin for fumigating insects in grain bins, or for vertebrate pest control as well, paraquat products primarily used with glyphosate resistant weeds, and of course we have many insecticides including Lorsban out there which uses chlorpyrifos. There's many things you can do with the license, but there's a couple things you can't do with this license. It is not a commercial license. We like to make that clear. So if you're for contract or hire, you want to make money off of applying pesticides, that would be the commercial license, not the private. If you're working for a tribe or a government agency of any kind, that's called the government license. And that again falls on the Department of Agriculture. We do answer questions regarding that, but they coordinate that part of the program. And with this license, you can't apply restricted use pesticides on your neighbor's land. You can't lend the license out and can't sell or give away pesticides. Now, we live in a time where we don't have as many restricted use pesticides. We have many general use pesticides such as Milestone and 2,4-D products that work exceptionally well. And we have less people that are really needing the private applicator license for just the restricted use products. But there are a couple other advantages to being part of this program. And that includes just being part of a platform that you'll get updates and alerts from us to receive pesticide and legal updates on new registrations, illegal registrations for products that once were legal. We'll give you some safety updates. Sometimes we find out safety information that we didn't know before regarding some products we previously deemed non-toxic. We definitely get you on those lists, whether it's from me directly or the agents that help me out with this program. And we have 56 extension agents that are also deemed local PAT coordinators, and they usually get you on their lists, and they'll send out mailers many times a year regarding specialized trainings that might be in your area. And in addition, this is just going to reduce non-target toxicity and poisoning through general awareness and trainings. And we have many examples of that as well. Now, if there are any questions, feel free to use the chat box, and they can filter through. And I don't mind people interrupting me once in a while. It does provide a little interaction anyway. So this can be a dry platform. If you see me in person, this is tough for me because I'm usually jumping on chairs and I'm harassing the back row and using props. So feel free to ask questions. Now, this is a good example of why a private applicator license is valuable. We do see occasionally poisonings occurring across the United States. This is one example of many with this type of product. This was phosphine gas. I believe they were using phostoxin, which is highly toxic. And this individual or family did receive it through a friend. I believe this is down in Lubbock, Texas. This friend was not certified. They thought they'd use it for, I think it was cockroach control in this example. And it ended up killing their 2-year-old girl. And it was just a few years after this, in 2010, we lost, I believe it was 2 to 3 other girls down in Utah. You might have heard of that through fumitoxin, same active ingredient. Once again, the point being that we don't hear a lot of about poisonings, but it is occurring here and there, and it's usually through non-education and individuals not informed about the products that they're using. Now, when we talk about non-targets, and this is where I jump around a bit, we need to understand that where we put our pesticides, we hope is where it's going to stay, and that's not always the point. And through education, we teach how we have the difference between targets and non-targets, and they commonly can move with drift, leaching, or what have you. And we'll just give you some common examples. As you can see here, this is not good. This was a research plot where the technician probably was in hot water over this. This was a glyphosate application, and as you can see, we have a fair amount of drift or wind that carried away these pesticide droplets. In a research scenario, of course, is get them hot water with the PI or the scientists. But when you're talking large scale, over 1,000 acres, this can be a huge lawsuit that can occur. And we do encounter that periodically here at MSU. Drift occurs through many different routes. There's many types of drift, whether it's particle drift, spray drift, or volatility, or what we call vapor drift. And I'm going to go quickly through this, but usually we think of wind being the primary culprit in drift, and that's usually the case. 90% of the time we're referring to spray drift, which is the pesticide droplets themselves being carried off site. And as you can see on the right, we have multiple examples of spray drift occurring here for various reasons. Really, the cutoff for spray drift, or to minimize that, we don't want to spray when it's any higher than 10 miles per hour, and that's pushing it. And again, just because let's say you're at 7 miles per hour, we have to understand our sensitive sites. If we start having a broadleaf crop nearby, a sugar belt, even at 7 miles per hour, that can carry it 10 to 20 feet at least. It depends on your droplet size. So ideally less than 3 miles per hour. But again, wind can be used to our advantage. If it's blowing away from a sensitive site, wind, you can have wind at 5 to 10 miles per hour, and that's to your advantage. So number one, we do have to identify our sensitive sites and then recognize I know I hear people laugh about beating the wind. You can wake up in the morning or apply later in the evening. If you do not have a temperature inversion where it's completely calm with clear skies, usually that's ideal. And you'll see all across Montana, the winds do pick up commonly at 9 a.m. You'll get a 2-3 hour window oftentimes. Now, wind, it does vary as according to what your droplet size is. If you have nozzles that are producing larger droplets, that will reduce drift significantly compared to finer droplet size. And with individuals that are applying with backpack sprayers, hand sprayers, of course, if you reduce that distance off the spray canopy, you will reduce drift significantly. But once again, this is all about understanding our sensitive sites to begin with before we start messing with spray tip height and worrying too much about changing out nozzles. Temperature has more to do with volatility. Usually this is where I really quiz the audience and we get interactive. It gets a little crazy about what's the proper wind speed, and people get giggling, or temperature. If it's above 80 degrees Fahrenheit, we tend to be more cautious with our spraying. There are many pesticides that will volatilize, or they'll turn from a droplet to a gas with temperatures over 80 degrees. And it depends on the pesticide itself. 2,4-D amine is a good example. It's not very volatile. You can get away with a little more compared to 2,4-D ester, which is highly volatile. So for those individuals that are pushing their luck and they need to spray when it's warmer out in the afternoons, we tend to point them towards the 2,4-D amine formulations to reduce that vapor drift. Humidity, we really can't control too much in Montana. We're pretty dry here in general compared to other states. Drier does make it a little worse, but we generally don't talk about this a lot. Can't control that really too much. Once again, with temperature, that has to do with the volatility of a pesticide as well. Each pesticide is ranked with a different vapor threshold, and I brought out some examples between 2,4-D amine and ester. Now, we do have some publications out there that break this all down, what I'm talking about. If you need that information, it's called Pesticide Movement in the Environment. You can email me. I can forward it to you for free, or look it up online. It's on the MSU Extension website. Now, this is where I usually get in trouble. I used to say it's ideal if you have calm wind conditions. That's not always the case. If you wake up early, the wind usually has died down, but if you have a high pressure system that's there for many days, no clouds in the sky, no wind, sometimes you see what you see here. And this is a temperature inversion. It's very, very dangerous to spray during a temperature inversion. This is usually set up in the evenings. It's where there's warm air above cool air, and you'll get a ceiling, as you see here, where the pesticide droplets do not drop to the ground very effectively. And many of the fine droplets will actually be carried in the air. They can be carried in the air up to an hour even, until the temperature inversion breaks up and a wind will actually carry these fine droplets off site. Sometimes we've seen shelter belts and sensitive crops damaged miles away from the spray site itself. So watch out for a temperature inversion. One common sign would be just driving down the road. If you've ever seen that dust hang in the air, that's a temperature inversion. If you see clouds low-lying like a fog, that's definitely a temperature inversion. There's various signs that are given off when this is occurring. For those that don't think spray drift is a big deal and probably won't encounter it, take a look at these surveys. I surveyed at least at 15 different locations, 329 applicators, and I asked them if they ever sprayed when they knew it was too windy. Up to 77% indicated at times they have sprayed when they knew it was too windy. Now, we often get people chuckling. It's like, of course we spray when it's too windy. It's always too windy. So it led us to the second question, which is, has spray drift damaged non-target adjacent crops according to the individuals that were spraying when it was too windy. And surprising enough to me, I was surprised to see this. It's almost half of those that replied indicated they did see spray drift damage a non-target site of some kind. And of course, this is an observational study. It has a lot more error than a controlled study, but to be honest, it's probably higher than that because this is just what they're noticing. So we're seeing more and more litigation in the state. It's a good reminder to applicators to really pay attention to spray drift. I'd like to say everyone solves things over coffee talk. That's not the case. We're seeing more and more litigation. So be aware of your drift. We're seeing a lot of drift damage adjacent sites as well. Here's some examples. Washington Department of Ag levies maximum fine for pesticides drifting over school. Very common for aerial applicators to get in hot water over this. Even in Montana, Missoula vineyard owner, definitely angry. Probably more than that, I'd say there's litigation about pesticides drifting from neighbors' trees. So that was probably due to mountain pine beetle application using carbaryl or a pyrethroid. And remember, many of these complaints sometimes are not valid, but it still carries a lot of weight. So we have some individuals that are properly diagnosing themselves, but we also have many individuals that, where there really isn't a lot of evidence to support the symptomology that they're experiencing. So it can be very difficult to diagnose. And it's just, these are situations that we just don't want to find applicators in because it can get real sticky either way. And it goes on, as you see on the left-hand side. And we can get into some huge cases in the Midwest with dicamba. I'll spare you that, which includes 1 million acres or more with the use of some of these dicamba-tolerant crops. But I'll spare you. We could go on and on. The easiest ways to reduce drift is just to understand what's going on. We want to get our droplet size as large as possible. You can do that through a variety of ways, whether it's lowering the pressure. As you lower your pressure, you will increase droplet size. And as you increase that droplet size, you will reduce drift, as you see with this figure on the right-hand side. This 3 meters per second, that represents about 6 miles per hour. And we're seeing, for instance, that the old extended range nozzles that were made in the 80s, a lot of people are still using them, those flat fan extended range T-jet nozzles. They're about at 150 to 200 microns, but they can go down to 100 microns to fine. You'll see about 5 meters of drift at 6 miles per hour at minimum, if not more. And we can cut that down to 0.3 meters just by increasing our droplet size using some of these reduced drift nozzles or, lowering our pressure. We can also use...
Dr. Tharp?
Yes.
Dr. Tharp, what does the quantity of water, like instead of 2 gallons per acre versus 20 gallons per acre, does that affect drift in any?
I usually don't hear that a lot. That's going to affect your water quality issues a lot. You can reduce water quality issues by increasing your GPA. It depends. If a result of that is you're decreasing or increasing pressure and it's changing your droplet size at all, yes, you're going to see a decrease or an increase in drift. You might see more drift, but as far as is it going to go farther, if your pressures are the same, it should not go. You shouldn't see the drifts go farther, but you might see more drift in that location because there's more coverage. It depends on the mode of action, whether it would cause more damage or not. So it depends with that question. There's some other factors.
Usually with more water, you're going to probably end up with bigger droplet size too if you're using the same pressure.
Yes, it's a method to increase coverage with larger droplet size. So to be honest, just having that larger droplet size will decrease drift. So if that was the purpose of increasing your output. Yes. So that is one way around it. You can decrease drift if they're increasing that droplet size, you bet, or decrease drift. Windscreens are also useful depending on this audience, but for boom sprayers especially, some individuals use these windscreens that block the wind. They always want to know exactly what that means, where the cutoff is. It's really vague. It certainly doesn't mean you can spray under all conditions, because you'll create a pressure gradient that will lift your spray pattern out. But you certainly can push your luck a bit. So if you have sensitive sites nearby, you certainly can go up to 15 to 20 miles per hour if these are used properly, which means you have to be perpendicular with the wind itself so it blocks it effectively. And on your turns at the end of your rows, you definitely have to shut off your sprayer, or you're going to see a lot of drift at those ends. Usually with windscreens, if we want to drive a little slower, that does have an impact on drift as well by driving slow. Now, I mentioned drift reducing nozzles. This is probably the #1 way we can reduce drift, is purchasing these newer technologies. Now, first off, we need to know, do we have sensitive sites nearby where we need to really worry about drift? Are we going to be pushing our luck where maybe we're not just spot spraying for an hour or so? Maybe our spray job is going to push us well into the morning hours where the wind could pick up a little bit. And I always say the same thing, take care of your sensitive sites first if you can, when you have ideal wind conditions. But if you still have to push your luck, if you're not using a pesticide that demands high coverage, and that's the high coverage pesticides generally are insecticides, some fungicides, and contact herbicides, such as paraquat, which you want to increase your coverage a little bit. If you're not using those formulations, and you'll be able to see it from the label will tell you exactly what your droplet size should be. But if you're using any of these systemic pesticides or herbicides, you certainly can go to the turbulence chamber designs that you see in the lower right-hand corner. That's a turbo T-jet. You can see it looks like a bit of a T. It's also known as a chamber orifice design or turbulence chamber design. That will reduce your drift by about 50% compared to the old XR nozzles that you see on the lower left-hand side. If your nozzle looks like that, that's the old style. They work good, they give good coverage, but really those are not low drift nozzles, at least anymore. Back in the 80s, they were known as that, but not anymore. On the upper right-hand corner, if you see that configuration on your sprayer, you're likely using what's called an air induction nozzle, or otherwise known as a Venturi. And these can reduce drift from 50 to 75%, some even higher than that, depending on how large you can make your droplet size. And that's going to refer back to your label itself. But the air inductions can get very coarse to ultra coarse droplets. Once again, you do lose a lot of coverage when you go to these drift reducing nozzles. If you're not offsetting that by increasing your output substantially, you will lose quite a bit of coverage. So it depends on the products you're using. Another non-target issue, again, I'm jumping around a bit. Each one of these topics is usually an hour, but we're trying to keep this interesting, is pesticide carryover. This is a huge problem in Montana right now, and it has been for at least 4 to 5 years, maybe longer. When the small grain prices went down significantly, we finally got our wish as IPM specialists. We got individuals to finally rotate their crops from small grain to some of these pulse crops. And that was a dream of ours, especially in the crop insect world, because that was the only way to break some of these cycles for whether it was cutworms or wheat stem sawfly. We didn't have a lot of tools for sawfly, at least. But with this going to these pulse crops or other broadleaf crops, it could even be alfalfa, which is more a conventional rotation. But this is rotating from a small grain in wheat or small grains in barley to a broadleaf crop. We've seen a significant increase in pesticide carryover problems from individuals that were used to these continuous systems for 10 years. They're introducing peas or canola or alfalfa, and all of a sudden their crops are wiped out and they didn't even apply a chemical. And this is because some of the chemicals they were using in small grains, they persist up to 3 to 5 years. And we need to be aware of that as well. Read that label. I'll go through some of the persistent chemicals that we have on the market today. But pesticide carryover is a big deal. We need to look on our labels at what we call rotation intervals. It'll tell you exactly what crops you can rotate into right away. And some crops you need to be careful about. You can have up to a 6-month or 3-year rotation interval with many picloram products, aminopyrrolid products, clopyrrolid, a whole bunch, and we'll go through that. Keep in mind also that during drought conditions, we tend to see more carryover, so it even can go past the rotation intervals indicated on the label if we're under a severe drought, because we're not getting that pesticide degradation that we usually would. With carryover, some things to look for. If you're rotating your crops, man, do a little research on the chemicals you use before you rotate your crop. Or if you're going to rotate your crops, understand what you're rotating to, and then select the appropriate pesticides for that season. When you are planting susceptible plants and crops in future seasons, just kind of write it down, figure out what are your best options. Keep in mind, if you're under drought conditions, these chemicals will persist longer. And if you're collecting manure from livestock or grass clippings from areas that were treated with pesticides, you really need to pay attention to what we call compost and manure restrictions. And this brings us back to a big issue that started back in 2009 to 11. We had up to 104 plant samples. That was per year coming through Scudder Diagnostics at MSU that were showing non-target damage. As you can see here, we had various vegetable plants, tomatoes specifically. They're the most sensitive with peas and beans, where we're getting the leaf curling and we're getting the extended leaf terminals and stem elongation, which is a marquee sign of damage from growth regulator herbicides. And that would include, could be from 2,4-D to aminopyrrolid milestone products or Tordon. But this, now I gotta be careful, this doesn't mean it was from milestone, but a lot of this resurgence did occur when the registration of milestone first hit the market in 2009. Dow Agro did point out, and they were correct, that there were some samples that were not aminopyrrolid, that were picloram and other products that you see here. And this represents the persistent herbicides that are on the market, that if you're using these active ingredients or products, you really need to pay attention to carryover, whether it's future crops or collecting manure or compost or grass clippings. We've had many individuals that collect grass clippings, or they hay their crop, and maybe some individuals are feeding it to their livestock, and then they find out their livestock are wiping out local trees that they had or shelter belts, what have you, from the manure. And that certainly can happen. The manure actually can concentrate these chemicals and cause more problems up to 5 years. We've even seen instances of 7 to 10 years of non-target toxicity with certain gardens, where they had to move their gardens if they were importing manure or compost that contain these residuals. And again, this is for picloram products, clopyrrolid, aminopyrrolid, aminocyclopyrrochlor. These are also known as the pyridine carboxylic acid herbicides, PCAs. They are the most persistent. It doesn't mean 2,4-D cannot do this, but 2,4-D, usually it's drift, because it doesn't last long in the soil, but these do. These can last for many years. Now, with that, I think we hit the 30-minute mark. So if everyone will use that chat box and just give a thumbs up to Walter, and he can make note that you attended this in case we do get credits, that'd be great. We just want to know you're
I
awake
think
out
you're
there.
kind of off the hook here, Cecil, because I don't see, Lindsay, do you see anybody that put in their name and request? I don't see anybody that did.
Okay. Okay, well, that's easy enough. We'll just move on then. How many
You're on
individuals are
mute,
online right now?
Lindsay. It's 8.
Okay. That's easy. We'll just move on then. The next non-target issue I'm going to jump to is just not protecting sensitive sites and organisms. You know, pretty common sense, but I'd like to mention this again. Anytime we got people involved, of course, we need to be careful around schools, playgrounds, parks, and hospitals. It doesn't mean for those that are licensed properly, they can't use products in those situations, but we usually have certain products that they can use, and they usually want children and individuals, of course, would be out of that area until after the reentry interval is passed. Aquatic areas, there's almost every pesticide used in terrestrial areas has restrictions for keeping the drift or pesticide droplets away from aquatic areas. Animals, of course, wildlife refuges have certain restrictions that are often on the label, so read that up. Pollinator restrictions also are common with many insecticides. So if you're using an insecticide for alfalfa weevil or mountain pine beetle, what have you, be wary of blooming crops nearby, as we have seen many lawsuits over hives that were devastated from the use of certain insecticides. And you'll see this on the environmental hazard statement on the label. It's usually page 2 or 3. Just be very aware of that. The bees don't just get killed locally. They often will carry the residual back to the hive to ensure that they destroy the entire hive and maximize the amount of damage that could occur from one application. We've definitely seen many hives get wiped out on Washington. It was just a few years back, and it was a huge lawsuit.
So just to interrupt real quick, Carol Osberg has said that she would like to get the credits if possible on this. She's been attending and just piped in that. I don't know if she has an applicator's license number on her, but she is a private applicator.
Okay. Yep. Well, just make sure you forwarded your name and applicator number to Lindsay, and we'll see what we can do. Usually we have them approved, but we'll do what we can.
So if you'd put your number, Carol, into the chat box, the applicator's number, we'll make sure and get you credit. Or try. If we don't, we'll just blame Cecil.
Yeah, there you go. It's a work in progress here. So the big one that sneaks up on people are plants, whether it's, you know, home and garden use or ag use, whatever, even trained applicators. It's usually this idea, oh, I can spray it on grass for rangeland control of noxious weeds, let's say. And they find out later that it's wiped out every evergreen and pine or every shelter belt around. So many of these products, especially in rangeland or pasture, or even some small acreages that we can use Tordon or some others, be really careful, get a wide berth from these trees and brush, because these pesticides will persist in the soil, and even if the roots pick this product up 6 months later through the soil, that often is enough to see the trees die the following season. You know, that we've had many calls on that one too, where we'll see trees dying a year after they applied the chemicals, and they say, well, it must be some other chemical, someone else was in the area. And that's not true. It's usually from the individual that applied a year before. It just takes that long to translocate. With pollinators, you know, again, this could be an hour-long talk. The big one is read the label. If there's an environmental hazard statement, it will tell you exactly how to approach pollinators with this product. Some products that are extremely hazardous, you cannot even apply over blooming crops. It could be at the base of a tree and you're using mountain pine beetle application of carbaryl or 7SL, whatever it might be, cutworms over a lawn, whatever it might be. But many that are moderately toxic will ask you to apply before dawn when the pollinators are not active, or when there's cooler temperatures. this is kind of dangerous. So be careful if you're taking that approach. It doesn't take much for those pollinators to get a hold of and bring back to the hive. So always read those labels and read the precautionary statements or the environmental hazard statements. Now we're going to move to a hot topic. We do have a little bit of time to cover this. This is even hard to cover in an hour, so bear with me on this. How safe is glyphosate? We've heard glyphosate in cancer now for quite some time. A lot of phone calls I'm getting on this, whether it's safe or not. And the first thing I'm going to say is safe is not the greatest word to use in science. Safe oftentimes is going to be dependent on your perspective, how you use it, how you protect yourself. Do you follow the label? There's so much that goes into this. So we want to talk about toxicity for now, and we'll go back to the safe idea. Glyphosate's been around a while. It's been registered since 1974. It is used across the United States, around the world, one of the most common chemicals used. It's a category 3 substance, and that refers to its acute toxicity, or what happens to an individual in a matter of seconds or minutes from one dose exposure. That's called acute toxicity. It's relatively low for glyphosate, one of the lower toxicity products on the market, according to tox trials. I consider this quite accurate when we look at acute toxicity, but there's a different picture when we look at what's called delayed toxicity or chronic toxicity, and we'll get to that next. This is a non-selective herbicide. Basically will impact anything green. It's generally used for complete burn down, for chem fallow for farmers and producers, or pre-harvest cleanup in various crops for producers. It's also available over the counter for residential use. There's a variety of products out there. The EPA has not identified this as a highly dangerous pesticide, hence it's a general use chemical. So let's tear into this a bit. Again, this is a map back in 2014 that's showing glyphosate use across the United States. Very common product. It's used in every state, including Alaska, heavily used in the Midwest, and that's due to the new GMOs and the new glyphosate tolerant crops that they have on the market today. And that's mixed with dicamba as well at times, or it was. And what we're getting to there is, I'll go back to that, but this has been widely used since 1974. And that's going to take us to this case and how much validity this has. In August 2008, a jury in San Francisco recommended Monsanto pay $289 million. There's a lot of little sub bullets to this. I'm just going to ram this through. There's been lots of updates on how much he owes in the end and this and that. But what we're getting at is that the jury did side with him, and the judge did go with that verdict. They did update it, and I think that was lowered quite a bit. And since then, there's been 8,000 cases filed against Bayer's Monsanto regarding its herbicides containing glyphosate, with the association that it's causing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of cancer, a very specialized type of cancer that is quite dangerous. October 2018, the Superior Court judge reduced settlement to $39 million, but Lee Johnson did have to accept that he will not see an appeal accepted by the California Supreme Court, la-da-da-da. And since then, in July 2020, an agreement, Bayer did propose to pay more than $10 billion in a class action lawsuit to settle thousands of claims that the popular weed killer Roundup causes cancer. Now it's at risk of unraveling. There's a judge that doesn't see some parts of this as legit, so we'll see how this pans out. Still ongoing. But the question I get a lot of times is glyphosate causing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma? And to evaluate this, we need to see where this is all coming from. Why would the jury even be tempted to side this way, if it is legit or not? And the IARC, or the Interagency Research Center on Cancer, did change its classification prior to that lawsuit, making glyphosate a 2A, classified as a 2A carcinogen, which means there's limited evidence in humans and sufficient evidence in animals, in its opinion, to warrant that it could be a carcinogen. Now, this is a chart where they're just saying limited evidence in humans. Let's keep that in mind. This is classified with red meat, burning wood, late night work shifts, professional hairdressers, emissions from high temperature frying. And one thing about risk that gets hard to assess is all these things are non-scientific. These are perceptual. Like we hear glyphosate is a 2A. It's very alarming to people, but those same individuals might not have any problem with professional hair dryers using some hair products or red meat, what have you. And this comes back to things we control and things we don't control. Often with things we don't control, we see individuals interpreting a higher risk with this. And keep this in mind, this is not saying it's causing cancer. They're saying it's possible, but they're also not telling us what the reasonable exposure would be to cause this. And this is something else to keep in mind. Did you have a question?
So you said they switched it to 2A. What was it before?
I believe it was either a 3 or a 4. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it went up to a 2A, and it's because there were a few studies that are showing some sort of association with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, some isolated studies. But let's just
By the way, we have a second person who wants credit, Sig Rudy, and he's given us his license number too.
Okay. Well, there we go. Well, we'll do a little poll at the end to just send your thumbs up that you're here, and they'll work. We'll get you. We'll try to get you some credits. So, like I mentioned, the IARC did classify it as a probable carcinogen. That helps this lawsuit along in this idea that it causes cancer, but we need to understand that this is all about concentrations, and I'm going to go back to that again. EPA did go back and reassess it once again, and they still maintain glyphosate is not a carcinogen. But when EPA does the review, they're looking at concentrations we'd expect, the highest exposures we'd expect from an occupational exposure of people working in the field, and they also apply a 10 to 100 times safety factor on that. It does not mean that they're looking at studies where they might have had a test tube and had some glyphosate that was directly put on embryonic cells, which we have seen as well, which has shown cancer. But again, is that a reasonable exposure that we'd expect from applying pesticide in the environment? The EU, which we always hear they're ahead of us, and they usually are a little more conservative than us. But the pesticide is still approved across Europe and the EU. I believe there might be 1 or 2 exceptions to that, but the EU itself, it's still approved for use in Europe until late 2022, where they'll re-review it. Now, what's going on? Because we're seeing this, and I'm kind of running you through why, but it's because we do have a couple cases where they did show an association. But a lot of the scientists are disregarding that. They look at it still, but there's low sample sizes in one of these, in the Erickson 2008, very low. It was based on phone calls, which, usually it's hard to factor out various things. And with the second study in 2003, same thing, low sample size, and we're dealing with observer bias. But we always are with epidemiological studies. But let me say to this, when you look at the overall numbers on the right-hand side, you can see we have 800 studies demonstrating safety and not seeing this. And we even have the epidemiological study of 90,000 private applicators called the Egg Health Study. And they did not see an association between non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and glyphosate use. And that's the most powerful epidemiological study that I'm aware of so far. And that was not included in the IARC's assessment initially. And this caused a huge debate as well. So now I have to be careful with this, because I'm not saying it can't cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I'm just saying at reasonable exposures, we wouldn't expect that from the data we're seeing. I already covered that. And this is why. What is a safe pesticide? Is it all chemicals are unsafe? Well, that of course is not true. Is it most chemicals are unsafe? Botanicals maybe. That's also untrue. And we can go all through this from pro-chemical to pro-environmental. And really, it's not even in the middle that some are safe and some are not safe. Safe is just not a scientific word we want to use. It's all about this. And this goes back to the father of toxicology. The relationship between dose and response is inseparable. You could take about anything, and if you get a high enough dose, it could cause damage. And that's even water. And we've seen athletes die from water, from leaching electrolytes out of their system. And it seems like a far out example, but I often urge my audience to push examples at me. And unless we get philosophical, it gets pretty tough. You could take about anything, and it's especially true like aspirin. Aspirin, a few aspirins could be beneficial. Many, of course, could be lethal. And we see this with nicotine and other things as well. And we certainly would expect it with any chemical, including glyphosate. But when is this reasonable? And I think EPA takes that into account a little better than the IARC, but we don't want to disregard the IARC. Everything's changing in science. We've seen that with Agent Orange, DDT. Now we know paraquat and rotenone are associated with Parkinson's disease as well. That's something to be aware of for those that didn't wear their PPE over their lifetime. That's true. We've learned Agent Orange now is a carcinogen. And of course, we weren't aware of that in the 70s and 80s, or at least the government wasn't making it clear that they're aware of that. So science is not about absolutes. It's about what the evidence is saying with the evidence and data we have so far. And overwhelmingly across the nation, when you talk to weed scientists and scientists, glyphosate, it's not that it's safe. It's that if you're following that label, long sleeve shirt, long pants, not getting saturated in the product, cleaning up after you're exposed, we've seen very little evidence to support that it's going to cause non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's possible with high dose exposures for individuals that are not washing up, and they might have a genetic profile, like for autoimmune disorders, where we do see more symptomology and health problems for individuals that have fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, allergies, asthma. We tend to see some things with those individuals that we don't see with others. So there's a lot that goes into this that muddies the water. And once again, before I close up, this could be related to the inert ingredients and not glyphosate itself. There's been a lot of talk that it's pretty solid, it's not glyphosate, but we have evidence to support that one of the inert ingredients used in a lot of the terrestrial glyphosate products has shown some association in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and it seems to match with the figures that we're seeing. But then again, that's not consistent either. And that could be because some products have this inert ingredient, others do not. So they're still looking into this. We do see a little different profile with people that have high dose exposures for sure. So I always urge people, this is not me saying it can't cause it. Protect yourself. And if you follow that label and protect yourself and clean up properly, you should be good to go. Now that's all I have. I've left a little time for questions and answer. We covered a lot of ground today, from non-targets to glyphosate and cancer, which is a huge topic in itself. So anyone have any questions?
Your implication on the glyphosate, that it might be the inert material that's causing it. The generics and the actual Roundup product, the inert ingredients can be different, eh?
Yes. That's why it's very difficult for epidemiological studies to verify exactly what's going on. Most of the epidemiological studies, like I said, are not seeing much, but there's a few that have. Now, they did not narrow down exactly what products these individuals were using, where the inert ingredients could vary. And another issue we're having is we don't have access to those inert ingredients. Those are patented. So scientists, even, we have to go through a process to even find out exactly what the inert ingredients are for specific products, because it's patented legally and it's not public information.
And that doesn't become public after the time of the patent has run out?
I believe you can access that information. No, to be honest, I'm not sure that is open, the patent. I think what gets open is the active ingredient itself. The active ingredient
Okay.
then can be used by other companies, but they need to develop their own carriers.
So if anybody has questions, type them into the chat area. I appreciate you taking the time to do this.